Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started in just a few minutes as we are getting going here and folks are getting logged on. Go ahead and share in the chat, what is your connection to rural grocery? We'd love to hear sort of why this is a meaningful topic for you, and we'll get started very soon. As we get started, we'd love for you guys to share in the chat box, what is your connection to rural grocery stores? We're starting to see a few comments come in. Would love to know, what's your connection and why are you joining this webinar series? We'll get started in just a few minutes, give folks a chance to log on and get situated. All right, well, thanks for sharing some of your feedback on what brings you to this topic, and feel free to continue sharing in the chat box what brings you to this topic, what is your connection to rural grocery stores. Welcome to the fourth installment of the webinar series, Keeping Groceries Alive, Successful Ownership Transitions for Rural Grocery Stores. My name is Rael Carver, and I'm a program manager with the Rural Grocery Initiative at Kansas State University. Thanks for joining today. The topic of rural grocery transition planning is such an important topic. All too often, we receive calls about grocery stores that are planning to close without a transition plan in place. And I've already seen that in the chat today. We hope that this webinar series will put this topic front of mind for grocers so a plan can be established and the store can continue serving its community. We've seen that it can be much harder to reopen a grocery store after it's already closed. So making a business transition plan early not only supports food access in communities, but also ensures the financial security of grocers as they approach retirement. Over the last few weeks, we've covered quite a bit. We've provided an overview on why we think that sustaining rural grocery stores is important, and we've talked about a variety of grocery ownership models. Last week, we discussed the steps for preparing for a business transition. Our partners at the Kansas Small Business Development Center, Jack Harwell and John Addisey, shared details on preparing your transition plan, building value in your business, and identifying tangible steps to complete a successful business transition. It was a great conversation, and if you missed it or want to rewatch it, the webinar, if you want to rewatch the webinar, you can find the recording along with the slides from the webinar and a few additional handouts on our website at ruralgrocery.org under the events tab. We've got the recordings for all of our previous webinars there. So today we'll be talking about assessing markets and community needs, When a store transfers ownership, it presents an opportunity for the store to look inward and consider how it can best serve its community. As a store prepares for transition, it's helpful to consider if there are new services to offer or whether the store needs a facelift. Have shopping patterns and needs changed in the community since the store first opened? Should the next grocery store stay in the same location as the current store? And here's a big one. Do the numbers support the viability of a grocery store? We'll be covering these key considerations and a lot more in today's webinar. We're really excited to be joined by Nadine Siegel, a community vitality specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and Stuart Reed, executive director of the Food Co-op Initiative. Before we begin, just a few first I'd like to acknowledge our partners, of course. We have a great team of partners who created this webinar series, and each of the organizations listed here bring a unique set of expertise, and we couldn't have developed this series without them. We also want to thank our sponsor, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, for making this project possible. And now onto the housekeeping before we get into our content here. So the webinar is being recorded. You can find our recordings on our website, as I mentioned, ruralgrocery.org under the events tab. The closed captioning feature has also been turned on, and attendees can control their individual caption settings by clicking the live transcript button on your Zoom panel. If you have any technical questions, our students, Lauren and Jess, are on standby and here to help you with any questions that you may have, so feel free to reach out. And finally, we'll have time at the very end to answer some questions. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. This should help us keep track of your questions and make sure we don't miss anything. You can also click the like button on the question if it's already been asked, if you want to be sure that that one's asked, and that will push it to the top so we can be sure to prioritize it. You're still welcome to use the chat box to share ideas and comments, but for specific questions, please use that Q&A box. With that, we're going to get started. So we will begin with Nadine Siegel, who will walk us through ways to assess your community during a grocery business transition. Nadine, take it away.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon. As Rael said, I'm Nadine Siegel. I work for K-State Research and Extension in Northwest Kansas. If we could move to the next slide, please. And so as we start to think about doing a community assessment, we really need to give some thought to what is our community that we want to look at. Commonly, we think of a community as a place, a location. And as you can see from the pictures on the side of the slide there, we're real good about welcoming people into our community, letting them know what our community is when we think of it as a particular location. But also communities can be peoples of interest where they have common things that they work together on, just shared interests on a project, or maybe it's their profession. We also have to think about the culture and the different relationships that go on within a community. And then there's also the political or the economic aspects of a community. And as we think of all these different things and we try to define what our community is, I like to look at the community capitals framework. The community capitals framework gives us an idea of 8 different areas that are all parts of a community. And if we have a strength in all 8 areas, it goes into the center really where we have a healthy ecosystem within our community. And so as you're thinking about a grocery store, we need to look at all these different capitals and how they affect things. And so we'll start first with financial capital. You know, that's the dollars that are in the community or where you can have access to some of those capital dollars. Think about your local resources there, such as your banks. Think about the wealth that's in the community, maybe the community foundation that's there. What type of living can a person earn within that community? All those things fall underneath financial capital. As we move down, there's political capital. And the first thing that comes in mind with political capital is politics. But that's not necessarily it. Think about the leadership within your community. Who are some of those influential people that you need to be talking to within the community to help you get started? Are there unusual voices that we need to be drawing into this to capture everyone within the community? Then we have social capital. If we don't have social capital within the community, really the community is going to struggle. Social capital is really the building block of a community where people learn to get along with each other, they build their relationships with each other, helping out with each other. As we get to the bottom there, we have human capital. And with human capital, it really refers to anything that helps build a person. So think about your educational resources, your healthcare resources, libraries. Those types of things fall underneath human capital. Then we have the cultural capital. What are some of the unique events and activities that go on within the community? Is there a particular heritage that's really strong within your community? As we look at natural capital, it's the environment around us, the green spaces that we have. Maybe we're in an area where there's a lot of agriculture. All those things contribute into the natural capital. And the last one is the built capital. And built capital refers to infrastructure within a community. And so right quick, we want you to take a poll. And so the question on the poll is, a grocery store contributes to which of the community capitals? And you'll answer this, it's a multiple choice, but yet you can select multiple answers. And we'll just give you, well, maybe 15 seconds right quick. Okay, and so as people selected it, interesting. I believe we have something in every single capital. And that would be my answer too, is that a grocery store really contributes to all the capitals within the community capital framework. We know definitely that the built capital is there with the structure of the store itself, the financial capital, and how it really can help a community as far as turning over dollars, the sales tax that's collected, the political capital, working with those leaders, the social capital. So many times the grocery stores where people come together and visit with each other. And so with that, I think we'll close the poll right quick and go on to the next. So as we start thinking about different community assessment models, a community assessment is really used to identify the strengths and weaknesses within a community. And it's kind of a process that we have to go through. As we do the assessment, that's probably the easy part of it, but it's what we do afterwards with the information that we find that is really incredibly important, because from that we can diagnose our situation, start planning, implementing, and then after a while, really be able to do an evaluation. If we move to the next slide, please. And so there's lots of different types of assessment tools, but we real quickly want to go through a poll and ask you what type of community feedback you've used before. And again, this is a multiple choice question, and so you can check the multiple answers. Okay, how about if we close it and show the results? All right, surveys are probably the most common type of feedback or assessment that people have used. And then focus groups and panel discussions. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So as we look at this, there's a lot of different types of community assessment tools. I think all of you know what the survey is, where you have those lists of questions that you send out to people, or maybe you collect that information at a group meeting. those types of things. But I really want to spend more time maybe on possibly 2 and 3 with asset inventory and community mapping. In my work, I do a program called First Impressions, and it's a case of having a group of visitors come into a community and do an asset inventory. We have a set of questions that we ask these visitors about the community that they go to, and then they tell us the strengths and weaknesses within that community. That's essentially what an asset inventory is, where you ask people to come together, list out the assets they see within the community. Normally, with an asset inventory, you're finding the strengths and identifying the resources that are already within a community. And if you combine that with community mapping, then you're able to place locations of where those resources are at. And if you want to take it even a step further, when you look at those assets, identify the community capital that's associated with it. And again, it could fall underneath multiple areas. But if you go through that entire process, it allows you to see which capital you may be not quite as strong in, where the strengths are. But the real key with any of these are to make sure that you've heard from all the voices within the community. Some things that people may not ordinarily think about as an assessment tool are looking at a daily activity schedule. If you're thinking about opening a grocery store or transitioning with a grocery store, knowing the daily schedules of folks within a community can be really important. Do you really need to be open at a certain time in the morning? Maybe it would be better to be open later in the afternoon or the evening. Or if you know that your major employer in town lets folks loose for lunch at a certain time, and a lot of small communities, they may have a deli there. Well, you would know then that maybe you need to have some extra help on hand as people came in to pick up lunch items. And so really, the daily activity schedule can be real key in helping you figure out how to schedule your employees within a store. The next one, looking at a seasonal calendar. The seasonal calendar can be real important for you to know when events are within a community, when you might have more people in to know how to schedule your help, and also when times might be a little slower. That calendar really can offer you a lot of information, and it may be something that if you know there's going to be a slower time, you can figure out some type of promotion or whatever that would bring people into the store a little more often. The next one, the community cafe assessment tool, is one where we have a set number of topics that we wish to discuss or to gather input from people. And we have a trained facilitator with at each of the tables where folks are to sit down and to discuss a topic, and then they'll move on around. And I like to think of this one where maybe I would be using a community capital framework model where we would have a facilitator host each one of those capitals, collect the information from the people as to what they thought the capitals were, and then they move on to the next one. They rotate through all of them so that you get input from everybody on it. One of the key things with a community cafe, though, is really to be using some type of food to attract people and to entice them. Focus groups, most of you have used focus groups and panel discussions, and so I'm really not going to spend much time on that one. So if we can move to the next slide, please. But who should you contact when you get ready to do a community assessment? Really, it's most everybody within the community. The different residents, make sure that you hear from all ages of the residents. Your elected officials are incredibly important. Community planners, economic development folks, law enforcement. Really, it's anybody who could be coming into the business and that you want to have their opinion from. But make sure you think about who some of those unusual voices are within the community that you might not hear from very often. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So as we think about this, I've listed some references here for you. The first reference is from the University of Kansas, from their community toolbox. It just gives you a real good idea of understanding your community and some of those partnerships that you need to build. The second reference is from Rotary International, and it reviews all the community assessment tools that I'd listed earlier. I really like this piece because it is written by a civic organization, so it's in language that everyone can understand. And I believe that these references will probably be placed upon, that you'll have access to them, that they'll be posted onto the website. And with that, at the end, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So if we go on to the next, yeah.
Okay, I think it's my turn now. I'm Stuart Reed. I work with the Food Co-op Initiative. We're a nonprofit organization, supports development of new food co-ops anywhere in the United States. So if you're looking in that direction, feel free to contact us. Our resources are free. And okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually look at the store itself as opposed to the community. And while a lot of this information might be relevant to our previous webinar on valuing a business, it isn't directly tied to it. It's information that would, if there's obviously shortcomings in the store that you would have to address, then that can affect the price. But really what we're looking at here is information about making sure that you have the best possible store for your community and that it can be financially viable. And I'm going to talk about 4 particular tools here: store audits, market studies, economic development research of varying kinds, and community food assessments. Okay, next. So a store audit is a simple in concept, and it can be very easily done, or it can be more complicated. A basic audit is something that you can do in your community with people that don't necessarily have a lot of training, but have good open eyes and are willing to look at things with a fresh perspective. And you're basically going to do a thorough walkthrough outside and inside the store, looking at all of the aspects of that store and how they impact customers, how they impact efficiency of the people working there. Safety, of course, is an important concern, especially now. But it's just basically looking at all of the different components within that store and thinking, how could this be better? Or is this good? What would I like to see differently? And if you're looking at that also with the potential for impact on the value of the business, certainly you're going to want to look at the maintenance, the existing equipment and fixtures, and whether they need to be replaced, upgraded, or whatever. And the illustration here is a store that was acquired and converted to, in this case, a food co-op. And you can see just by looking that there are a few obvious issues. The walls and finish aren't particularly attractive and kind of a jumbled display. But we're not going to go into that right now, but just that's the kind of thing you'll be looking at. Okay, next. And you can go a step further and you can hire either a mystery shopper, which is a less expensive option, but it's somebody that has experience in doing basically what we just outlined, coming into the store without letting you know that they are not just a regular customer. In some small towns, that might be hard to do, but that's their goal, to just act like a regular customer while taking notes and keeping track of the things that he or she sees. And then you get a full report back later. And some stores use that ongoing just to keep themselves sharp and to know what they might not be seeing because they're looking at it every day. But it's certainly an easy way to get a good overview of what the store looks like to a disinterested shopper. And taking that up a notch, you could actually hire someone to organize an audit for you. And they would come in with a prepared checklist of all the kinds of things that they know are important to a store, and go through that whole thing and give you, when they're done, a very complete report, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they would recommend seeing changed, the highest priorities for change, and things that could drive revenue up in the store by being improved upon. So a project like that there's varying ways to get it, but you're going to have to invest a couple $1,000s at least, probably, if you wanted to go that route. Okay, next. So that's looking at the actual store itself. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the market. And by market, I'm referring to all of the people that are potential customers of the store, whether they're in your community immediately, in the surrounding area, neighboring towns. It all depends on the situation and the competition and the distances. So a market is not always easy to identify right away, but it's all the people that potentially would want to shop at your store. Okay, next. And this is one place where I do really recommend, for anything but the simplest transition of ownership, that you get a professional market study done. And while it's kind of expensive, there are some reasons why it's important. You can't rely on the existing revenue stream of the store to be consistent going forward. In fact, you're probably going to want to hope that it gets better, because you're going to want to make some changes. New owners like to improve on things. They may choose to have new product lines or different services, and all of those kinds of changes, sometimes even just the personality of the people in the store, can make a big difference in your revenue. And the financial projections that you're going to use to determine whether or not the store can be viable are based on that revenue projection. So if you have an accurate projection of how much money is going to be coming in, it's a lot easier to have an idea of how profitable, or if a store could be profitable. And it's also going to be a lot easier to go to a lender and with a market business plan that shows that you have financial credibility based on an outside objective research. So those are reasons why I would encourage you to hire someone to do that market study for you. Even if you're pretty sure you know what the revenues are going to be, having it verified can give you a lot of confidence. And when you get that study done, how do you use it? It should not go into a dusty drawer somewhere. I mean, you're going to use it for your business planning, obviously. The revenue projections are first and foremost. And secondly, it's going to tell you a little bit about the competitors and how big your market area actually is. If your store had a better inventory, could we be drawing people from neighboring towns? That would be the kind of thing that you might get out of that research. It also tell you something about your nearest competitors. And in a rural grocery store, your nearest competitor, in some cases, I've heard of them being as far away as 60 to 70 miles, but they could easily be 10 or 15 miles, and it might be a Walmart. So what is you can do in your store to compete with those people effectively? What is it that they don't provide that you can, besides the convenience of being close by, which is very important? And you may also get some recommendations in the product and services that the store can provide based on that research as well. So there's a lot that you get out of it. And it's also a good way to talk to your community about what your vision is for the new store and how you can improve on what's currently happening and what your exciting opportunities are. Okay, next. And I sort of started in on this already, I guess. But if you are looking at operational changes, if you're thinking of those, you would probably want to make sure that whoever's doing your market study is aware of the things you're considering so that they can evaluate what that impact would be in future business and future sales. And the business plan that you're making then is adjusted to either incorporate those changes or not, depending on what you get back for feedback. And the revenue projections are a necessary part of creating financial budgets. And having those financial budgets is taking you the next step beyond how much do we need to buy the business, but how will the business perform once we have bought it and it's operational? What are our expenses? What are our incomes? Is there a balance left at the end of the day? We certainly hope so, but you need to have that information to do it. And as I said, you can use it to help build community trust and engagement in the project. That's a very important outcome for using market studies. Okay, next. Civic resources that may be available to you or may be something you want to invest in, but a lot of times they already exist. A lot of communities do various kinds of research about business development, where investment is needed, what kinds of businesses the community wants and needs. So some of that research may already be out there, and it may be specific enough to be even a food or general needs assessment. I've talked to several communities that have done food assessments because they're interested in knowing how well their current needs are being met. If it's a smaller community, you probably don't have as much of that kind of research, but you may have some, or you may have some for a broader geographic area that could still be helpful to you. Any kind of research that's been done by the community or your area can be helpful. It can help inform you. It may not be all you need, though. And again, economic development research and plans that have been done. If the city decided that they will have money to invest in some kinds of businesses, in creating new jobs, perhaps there's areas of town that need to be redeveloped. There's old sites that are vacant that they want to see used. There's all kinds of possibilities, and it's very important to do your research to see if any of these kinds of incentives or resources are available to you. Okay, next up. So it's in evaluating your market and the store possibility, you really need to know how much it's going to cost you to do the project. And whatever the acquisition cost is for the business itself is only a part of that. And it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of other expenses that you'll have to be prepared for, and to know when you need to have money available along the timeline. We have developed with help of some friends from our community, a really detailed sources and uses budget template that works for food co-ops and would probably work for other businesses as well, with a few adjustments. It looks at what the typical costs are to provide equipment and fixtures per square foot in the store, what kinds of things you pay for before the store opens, which could include consulting fees, licensing fees, inspections, repairs, new equipment, new fixtures, new inventory, salaries for people that are working before the store opens for business. You have to have money to cover all of that. And very importantly, you also probably need to come up with some working capital. In other words, extra money to have in the bank when the store opens, because most businesses will have losses in the first year. It takes a while to get efficient and to get up to speed. So having a little money set aside for early losses and to keep your cash flow positive is an essential part of that development budget. Make sure you think of all these things and not get caught off guard after you've already bought the business and are trying to keep it running can be a really big advantage. I've heard that more businesses fail for cash flow reasons than because they couldn't ultimately be viable. So take that into account, please. And where you get your money also impacts whether you can be viable in the long run. Bank loans have to be repaid on a pretty tight schedule and at market rate interest. Other kinds of money, community investments might be more flexible. You might be able to sell shares in a business, particularly if it's a cooperative. You are open to having community investment opportunities that are much more flexible than bank loans and possibly much cheaper in terms of interest. So look at where your capital is coming from and when it has to be paid back and how much you're paying in interest. Certainly SBA loan guarantees can be a helpful way to get a banker involved, but they won't reduce the cost of your debt. And that's something that you do want to look at. And then all of this, your startup costs, your revenue projections, and everything else that you know about the operating expenses of the store will get put together into a multi-year budget of how the store will do financially. And you want to see that that store can be profitable within 2 or 3 years generally. But before that, it has to be able to be cash positive. And the two aren't the same. You can have a positive cash flow before you're actually profitable. and that can carry you for a while, but not forever. So again, that's why you need the working capital up front. But that financial projection that shows your expenses and your income broken down over time is what ultimately the tool you use to convince yourself and lenders that this is something worth doing. Okay, next. And it's my turn to turn it over.
All right, thanks, Stuart. I am just going to take a couple minutes here before we get to the Q&A to sort of sum this all together and describe why we feel like these two topics are so important and why they are connected. So in our experience at the Rural Grocery Initiative, this information gathering phase, when you're assessing the community, assessing the market, is an excellent time to involve the community in this process. And we've seen that just because a store owner is ready to retire and a change of ownership might be on the horizon, it doesn't mean that the business needs to stay exactly the same. And this is something I'm reiterating what Nadine and Stuart have said. This transition is really an opportunity to hear from customers and hear how the store can be improved, how the store could better suit the community's needs. And so using some of the tools that Nadine mentioned is really important. But in terms of getting community feedback, another tool or resource or idea that we've seen success with has been when communities have some sort of team or task force or committee, sort of a leadership team that is kind of moving this process forward. And the reason why a team like this can be so helpful is that as you're trying to get community feedback, you have some people that can help you do that. They can help with focus groups or help with advertising about a survey. And then you also have a built-in group of people that can help make decisions with some of the information that you gather from the survey or focus group, so that there's a group of community residents involved in this process with some say and input in some of the decisions that are being made, that just builds the community buy-in for the long run. The other piece that I think is important to note here is that while we really would love this to be a linear process, it doesn't always turn out that way. And I think that that's an important thing to know as you kind of dive into this process, that these two pieces of assessing the community, assessing the market, really build on each other. And there's a lot of back and forth that can take place. So maybe you are sending out a survey and you hear some feedback that community residents really want to see a deli in the store, but that's not necessarily what the store was laid out for before. Then that information is going to be important in the market study and the business planning and some of the projections that you're going to work on. And even things like maybe the store is an older building and the shape of the building itself is just sort of, there are just insurmountable costs in terms of retrofitting it. Maybe you'll be looking at a new location for a grocery store. And what does that mean for community residents? Will people change their shopping habits because of that change in location? Or is it something people are totally fine with? So you may have to go back and get some more feedback after some of these decisions are made from kind of a first round of community input. And so the takeaway here is that there can be a lot of back and forth during this process, and that it is totally okay and totally normal for this process to take time. So when we get calls from communities in the middle of this process, we strongly encourage to use some of the tools that Nadine and Stuart have mentioned to get a baseline of what can this store do and how can this store serve the community. So with that, I think we have some time for questions, and I'm going to ask Stuart and Nadine to turn their videos back on, and we will take a few minutes here to respond to a few questions. If you have any other questions that you would like to pose to our presenters, now would be the time to type those up in our Q&A box. I also, before we get into the Q&A, I want to highlight that next week's webinar on planning your business will really follow nicely after this discussion on sort of what tools can you use to really look more closely at those numbers and financial projections. So that will be something to definitely keep in mind for next week. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our questions here. So the first one is actually for Nadine. And this is a question about how can community partners assist with keeping rural grocery stores afloat? This is a big question. You know, what are the roles that community partners can play in sort of assisting grocery stores in either staying afloat or in this transition? How do you feel like community partners can be involved in that?
Now, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of small towns is the customer service that the various businesses do to promote each other's business. Some of those partners, if they are a business owner, as people come into town and somebody asks them, what's there to do, or what's unique about different businesses within those your community, make recommendations about the businesses in the community, and that you really ought to go over here to try shopping for this. It's really being supportive of each other. That's one of the best recommendations that I could give.
Great. Stuart, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what you think of as a community organization, but there's always opportunities to be a part of the discussion, to help keep the word out there about there's a transition happening, and we'd love to hear your ideas, and we can be a resource for where to hold be a venue or whatever. It can be a discussion in a church group, for example. A lot of times they have a lot of interest in health and community safety. So whatever the group is in the community, there's a way they can help. And if they can help financially through a transition, that's often a big problem too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the other things I think about is that as civic organizations or groups get ready to do events where they need supplies from a grocery store, buy local.
Yes.
Don't go out of town to the big box stores and buy your supplies. Support your local business, your local grocery store.
Great. So we've gotten some questions on where could someone go to find some resources for market study? Stuart, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, we have a couple of individuals, consultants that we especially recommended for cooperatives because they understand the business model as well as the grocery industry. But generally speaking, there's a variety of firms that provide this kind of research. Your SBDC office can probably help you quite a bit in locating the right one for you, or may even provide some of that kind of market research themselves. If there's anybody that's doing, like people at Kansas State have in the Rural Grocery Initiative, I'm sure have resources they can refer you to as well. So I think it's part of the networking of finding information for your project. Making connection locally is always better when you're looking for people to help, because they know your market better and they know, just have a better background. But that said, there are people that work across the United States that can do an excellent job if it's their field of expertise.
Yes, and I would, speaking from the Rural Grocery Initiative's perspective, I would second what Stuart said, which is that we do have some contacts that we can share of market study resources that at least we know work in the Kansas area. So that's something. The other thing also that Stuart alluded to, and this kind of follows up with what I was saying about things kind of connecting and being a little more circular than linear, is that sometimes you can get some maybe less detailed but publicly available data from your local SBDC that will give you sort of a starting point. And so that can give you maybe some information on just how many customers are there in your area. And then you're able to kind of use that to make a few decisions, and then maybe in the long run, have a market study. So there's definitely some back and forth that happens in this process, as I mentioned. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention. Okay, so there's a question on some of these, similar to what we just asked Stuart, related to the store audits. So are there resources for getting outside help on store audits?
Anybody want to, Nadine, you got anything to?
Yeah, I don't have too much there other than if they need energy audits of a store, going through some of your regional planning commissions so that you can get in contact with some of the REAP programs, the rural energy. Oh, I'm not going to remember what the acronym stands for, but look at your regional folks that can help you there.
I do have acquaintances who do store audits. They've done most of them, again, for food co-ops, but as a grocery store, the differences are minimal and would be able to do them also for any other kind of store. They've actually developed a way to do it virtually during the COVID pandemic, where only one person comes into the store and will videotape the store, walk through it, capturing all of the specific things that are of interest, and one or more people will review that and then do the rest of the reporting from it. Colluminate is the name of the organization that's involved in that, but there are probably others that could do it, and I can put their website address, which is just colluminate.coop, in your chat box.
Great. The other thing that occurred to me, Nadine, is that the idea around the first impressions, I think, could be modified for specifically a grocery store to just get some outside perspectives. And it may not be as formal as some of the options Stuart was outlining, but it could be one way to get some just fresh ideas on the store.
And when we do first impressions, we ask that they go into the different businesses, and grocery stores are one that they commonly do go in and that we get feedback on. In some cases, it's been maybe they're in a community that doesn't have a grocery store. They're going to a community of the same size, and so they are really impressed by what they're seeing. And it gives them hope that maybe they can someday have a store there too.
Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about getting some feedback from community members, and maybe that means working with some new businesses or combining businesses. Are there any examples of sort of unique collaborations that you've seen at grocery stores of kind of multiple different entities or services that are provided in a store?
One of them
Both
that
of
comes
you.
to mind in Northwest Kansas right now is it's in Grinnell, and their grocery store has been through several transitions recently. But the last time around, the beauty shop ended up with space in the back of the grocery store. They also put a deli in there, and so in a community that is only about 400 people in size, they were able to keep 3 essential services there where people could come in, have their meal, as well as the groceries that they need, and with the beauty shop in there.
I've seen credit union or bank outlets in grocery stores, usually a little bit larger communities, but not they don't have to be huge for that to work, because as banks are getting away from physical space for so much of their business, a small outlet like that could be ideal.
Yeah, I'd say a couple examples of unique kind of collaborations we've seen have been a grocery store that also works with the local florist. And so those two businesses are combined under one roof. We've also seen some grocery stores that also have a hardware wing. And those came directly, really, some of those concepts came directly from feedback that those communities heard. And so again, it's just so important to hear what the community is leaving town for. And so how can you keep them in town? So go ahead.
I'm sorry. One of my favorite small town food co-ops is in Finland, Minnesota. It's over 100 years old. They sell food, as you would expect, but they also have fishing tackle and hardware and T-shirts and gift items for tourists coming through. And it's kind of your old-fashioned general store concept. And they've made that work for a long time.
So, okay, so what if, this is a big one, what if the numbers don't suggest that there would be a viable grocery store? Stuart, how do you move forward from there?
That happens a lot, especially when you're starting from scratch. It's really, most of the time, the initial projections say it doesn't look good. So that's when you have to start playing with things. What can we do to either reduce the expenses or increase the income, have more revenues in general to offset the overhead? You have to look at changing your business plan in some way that can affect one of those outcomes. It may mean that you have to look at different product mix or different services than what you originally thought. And you may have to find a way to cut expenses, either in the startup budget or in the operations. And those aren't easy things to do. You're looking at the margin of what you can sell the product for. You can't simply raise the prices of goods to make up for the losses, or you're going to lose customers over high prices. So, but there is a combination of factors there that you can work with to rebalance your budget at a better place. And sometimes the easiest way to do it sometimes is, again, in the capital that you raise, making sure that you're not on a tight budget for repayments and high interest rates, if there's any way to do that. Some businesses just can't be viable. I mean, that ultimately that is the case, unfortunately.
And again, I think that's where you can maybe be creative with what other offerings are you providing? How can you change the numbers a little bit in your favor from what has been going on to what what you can add to it? So Nadine, there's been a question on some of the sort of online tools or software that you could use for some of the mind map, or for some of the mapping projects that you mentioned, community mapping. Do you have anything to share there?
Yeah, when you go through that community asset process and identifying those assets, putting them into a mind map format is one of the easiest things that you can do. And if you just Google mind mapping, there's all types of software out there that you can either purchase it, or there's many free ones. One of them that I have found easy to use is mind mapping. It allows you to build the different layers in there and visually see it. Otherwise, if you have space and you can put that out on a wall, draw it out on the wall where you can see it all the time, that's really a good and simple idea, because it's there in front of you and you can real quickly add things onto it. But the software, there's lots of it available out there.
Post-it notes, lots and lots of post-it notes.
Mm-hmm. What I do is I go to our news office. They have end rolls of newsprint. And so I can cut off pieces, long pieces of it, tape it up onto the wall, and then be able to draw things out onto the wall and continue to add to it.
And so what about, can you elaborate maybe a little bit, Nadine, on some of the community partners that could be involved in a community food assessment or maybe on a grocery task force? What are some of those key stakeholders that you want to incorporate?
Some of the key stakeholders that you would want to incorporate would be folks from your economic development department, maybe somebody from city council. Look at your clergy, or if you have a ministerial alliance, county commissioners. Go to your schools, look at the school administration, whether it would be the superintendent, maybe somebody from the school board. Right there is a possible good purchaser of product from your stores if you can get the school buying from you rather than through somebody else. And then as you start looking at the civic organizations that are in town, see who the leaders are of those organizations or the officers and invite those folks. Don't forget about the youth. The youth are a tremendous resource in our communities. And if we want them to be coming back to our communities so that our businesses can survive, we've got to make them a part of the conversation. And so again, the schools can give you their youth organizations. A lot of times the city offices have the lists of organizations, whether it's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, through Extension 4-H, some of the other groups that Extension works with, such as it's the old homemaker units, as some of them would call it. And then as you start thinking about some of the unusual voices, go to your demographics and look to see what your percentages are within the different age categories. So that if you see that you're having a trend of 25 to 40-year-olds move back, that you go to the employers, your largest employers in town, and have them maybe make some recommendations of who might be a good person to participate in the focus group or as part of a planning team for it.
Great. And so I think we are about to wrap up here. If there are any other questions, feel free to add those in the Q&A. I think the one last question here would be, do you have any examples of an existing business, a private business that has facilitated their own sort of community mapping or assessment process just to better understand their audience and evolve? Maybe it's not associated with a transition, but it's a tool used for a business to adapt. Do you have any experiences, either of you, with that?
This is something we're getting ready to do in Northwest Kansas. We previously have been going through a process called strategic doing, where we would identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then have people give us their big ideas of what they would like to see happen and map that out so that everybody can see it. As Stuart said, use sticky notes to get everybody's ideas up there on the wall. But at this point, we want to try to do this on a county level so that as our counties in Kansas, rural counties seem to be getting smaller, we want to make sure that we're more inclusive, try to expand that to a regional area, because we all have to work together.
And Stuart, any thoughts on that question, on how to adapt, how to get feedback and adapt as a private business or even a co-op?
I think it's the same process you would use in evaluating your market that we've gone through, really. But just knowing that you've already got the business means you have a better grip on what you can afford to invest, what's been tried before. But I think I'd go through a very similar process. I can't name any specifically because I don't tend to work much with stores after they open. But I do know that if you're a member of any kind of professional association, like Independent Natural Food Retailers is one, National Co-op Grocers is another, they provide some of that kind of help with that kind of a project. And there may be, again, SBDCs also would be a resource for looking at how to envision your future and move toward a better future for your business.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up for today, but this was a wonderful discussion on how grocery stores and communities can be aligned and work together. So we will move forward in our slides and share a few of our upcoming webinars. So we're halfway through this webinar series, and just as a note, we plan to send a survey by email to all of our attendees from the past 4 webinars. We'd like to get your feedback on the series, and we'll incorporate some of your feedback into the remaining topics. So all of our upcoming webinars will continue to be held on Thursdays at 1:30 Central, and we have some great topics coming up, some that we've already alluded to here. So you can see the full schedule and descriptions on our website. We've listed kind of who will be presenting for each of these upcoming webinars, so you can see that there. Lastly, I will just announce our 5th webinar in this series will be next week. We'll be talking about business planning. We'll talk through some of the business planning considerations a new grocery store might need to think about. We'll have Network Kansas and the Kansas Small Business Development Center here to share some tips on getting started with a business plan. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Stuart and Nadine, for presenting, and we hope to see you all next week.